There is a very specific kind of human suffering that is not characterized by the acute intensity of a physical blow, but by its monotonous, slow, and corrosive persistence. I'm not talking about the sudden tragedy that arrives like a car accident, splitting life in two in a dramatic instant. I'm talking about the silent and invisible torture of stagnation. It's the brutal and lonely experience of waking up morning after morning, opening your eyes to the same damp-stained ceiling, feeling the gravitational weight of the same unresolved financial problems, facing the same loneliness that sleeps beside you in the empty bed, or dealing with the same stubborn medical diagnosis and being forced to admit with a stomachache bordering on panic that absolutely nothing has changed. The calendar on the wall ticks relentlessly. The seasons change color outside. The people around you seem to move at cruising speed. Friends getting married, colleagues getting promoted, neighbors buying houses, relatives getting cured, but your life seems frozen in time, trapped in a cruel loop of repetition where the renewed hope of the previous night is systematically murdered by the still reality of the following morning. You prayed fervently in the early morning. You decreed words of faith before the mirror. You fasted until your body felt weak. You did everything the religious manual dictated, but the sky remains the color of polished bronze, and the earth beneath your feet remains dry and hard as iron. In our contemporary culture, addicted to the cheap dopamine of instant gratification, where speed is synonymous with blessing and delay is seen as a system error or a curse, biblical waiting is an offensive scandal. We have been psychologically conditioned to interpret God's silence as personal abandonment. When the answer doesn't arrive within the time frame, we set in our agendas, our theology collapses, and the mind whispers humanity's oldest and most toxic lie. God doesn't care, or worse, God has lost track of my address. However, the Bible, with its brutal and therapeutic honesty, refuses to sell the illusion of an easy and linear life. She draws us into dense, earth-stained narratives that challenge our anxious stopwatch, introducing us to men and women who inhabited God's time zone, a strange and rarefied place where a day can seem like 1,000 years, and where silence is not the absence of activity, but an intense, heavy, and necessary form of divine gestation. To decode the sacred and painful architecture of this waiting, we need to travel far from golden palaces and easy victories, descending the damp stone steps to the underbelly of history, to find a 17-year-old boy who, unknowingly, became the patron saint of all those who wait. His name is Joseph. But I urge you to delete from your mind now the cinematic image of Governor Joseph, the powerful man dressed in fine linen with gold rings and Egyptian makeup, giving orders to empires and saving the world. That man is the end of the story, and focusing on the end now robs us of the vital lesson of the process. I want you to visualize the Joseph of Genesis 37, the dreamy boy who was brutally awakened by human wickedness. His journey to God's waiting room did not begin with a promotion, but with trauma. It began in Dothan on a scorching hot day when the colorful tunic, that extravagant garment that represented the exclusive favor of her father, Jacob, and the promise of a superior destiny, was violently ripped from her frail body. The cistern is the first stage of waiting. It is a place of forced and unexpected containment. Joseph's brothers, consumed by a cancerous envy that had been festering for years, fueled by their father's reckless favoritism and Joseph's own arrogant naivete in recounting his dreams of grandeur, decided in an improvised court in the desert that the solution to the dreamer's problem was the cancellation of his existence. They throw him into a dry well. Try to imagine the terrifying sensory experience of that moment. The sudden fall, The dry impact against the hard-packed earth, the rising cloud of dust, the darkness swallowing the sunlight, leaving only a bright, distant circle high above. Joseph screams. He calls for Reuben, for Judah, for Simeon. He pleads for the memory of the blood they share. He invokes his father's name. But the only answer he receives is the echo of his own voice beating off the narrow, cold walls of the cistern. The Bible, with a chilling economy of words, describes the brothers' attitude immediately after the crime with a phrase that defines human cruelty. And they sat down to eat bread. While Joseph lived through the terror of abandonment and the claustrophobia of imminent death at the bottom of the pit, his brothers had a peaceful picnic on the edge. They broke bread, listening to the cries of their youngest brother. This icy indifference of the world in the face of our personal pain is one of the hallmarks of the waiting season. It seems that the universe continues to spin, people continue to eat, laugh, and post their happiness on social media, totally indifferent to the fact that their world has just collapsed. There, at the bottom of that pit, without water, without dignity, and without a way out, Joseph learned the first lesson of waiting: absolute solitude. His tunic was gone. His father was not there to protect him. His brothers had revealed themselves to be mortal enemies. Only he and the deafening silence of God remained. Where was the God who sent the dreams? Why didn't he send an angel to hold the brothers' hands? If you feel naked, exposed, betrayed, and alone in your problem today, know that you have just enrolled in the school that has produced the greatest governors in history. The cistern is not the end. It is the dark womb of a new beginning that you cannot yet see. The escape from the cistern was not, as Joseph surely prayed desperately for it to be, a triumphant return to his father's safe arms in Canaan. Paradoxically, it was a deepening of the nightmare. Seeing a caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites crossing the horizon with their camels laden with spices, balm, and myrrh, descending towards Egypt, Judah's pragmatic greed spoke louder than his murderous instinct, transforming tragedy into business. What profit will there be in killing our brother and concealing his blood? Come, let us sell him. Joseph is lifted from the pit, blinking before the sudden sunlight, not to be saved, but to be traded. 20 pieces of silver. That was the set price of a young dreamer's life on the stock exchange of human envy, the value of a wounded slave. While the cold coins changed hands and he was tied with rough ropes like any other commodity behind the camels, Joseph was about to begin the most painful and transformative journey of his life, the geographical and spiritual descent into Egypt. Each step on that hot, unstable desert sand, each kilometer the caravan slowly advanced southward, represented a violent and definitive rupture with everything that defined Joseph's identity and security. He was physically distancing himself from Jacob's colorful tent, from Isaac's sacrificial altar, from the land of promise made to Abraham. He was being torn from the covenant ecosystem and forcibly dragged into the pulsating heart of world paganism. The predominant feeling in this phase of waiting is not just stagnation, but aggressive regression. This is one of the most confusing pains of faith. How many times, while waiting on God for a promise of advancement, do we feel that life is not only standing still, but moving backward at high speed? We pray for healing, and the new examination shows that the disease has progressed. We pray for financial provision, and the debt doubles. We pray for restoration in marriage, and the spouse asks for a divorce. Joseph must have looked at the familiar mountains of Hebron, slowly disappearing on the dusty horizon, and asked with a shattered soul, "Where is the God of my dreams? If I saw the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down before me in reverence, why am I chained like an animal being led to the slaughter?" The theology of waiting, however, offers us a night vision lens to see what was happening in the invisible gears of history. That human trafficking in the sovereign eyes of God was a transport of seed. Joseph was not being expelled from history. He was being sent to save history. Egypt, the superpower of the time, needed to be saved from an apocalyptic famine that would come years later. And the only person on earth with the spiritual DNA and administrative wisdom to manage this global crisis was Joseph. But Joseph could never save Egypt by living comfortably in his father's tent in Canaan, protected and pampered. He needed to be positioned in the geography of the crisis before the crisis arrived. The excruciating pain of separation, the public humiliation of the sale, and the physical brutality of the desert journey were, in fact, the logistical mechanisms of divine providence. God was moving his most valuable piece to the center of the chessboard, but to infiltrate his agent into enemy territory, he needed to camouflage the prince in the clothes of a slave. The painful wait is often simply the process of transporting the seed to the right field, where it can die and bear fruit. The arrival in Egypt was an absolute cultural, sensory, and spiritual shock. The Great Pyramids were already there, piercing the sky like gigantic monuments to death and human idolatry. The Nile River, worshipped as a deity. The strange guttural language, the transparent linen clothes, the gods with falcon, jackal, and crocodile heads on every corner. Joseph, the Hebrew boy raised in the monotheistic simplicity of pastoral tents, was thrown into the chaos of the slave market of a sophisticated and perverse metropolis. There, stripped of his last layer of dignity, he was exposed, groped, his teeth examined, and his muscles assessed as if he were cattle, and finally bought by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's personal guard. The transaction was concluded with a handshake. The door to freedom slammed shut. Joseph was now the legal property of another man. At that moment, the waiting ceased to be a momentary crisis in the system and became a permanent state of existence. His identity suffered a mortal blow. He was no longer Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob. He was merely the Hebrew slave. The loss of identity is the most critical and dangerous point in the waiting room. It is when we forget who we are because circumstances scream otherwise every day. But it was precisely there, in the suffocating anonymity of slavery, surrounded by idolaters and without any Bible or prophet nearby, that the biblical narrative inserts the phrase that changes everything. And the Lord was with Joseph. This is the revelation that sustains the soul in hell. God's presence is not geographical. It did not remain confined to the border of Canaan. It descended with him to Egypt. It entered the slave market. It endured the chain and walked into Potiphar's house. God does not deliver us from waiting instantly, but he enters into the waiting with us. External stagnation did not prevent internal divine companionship. Joseph lost his tunic, he lost his family, he lost his freedom, and he lost his name, but he did not lose the presence. And as long as he had the presence, he had the seed of the future within him, waiting for the right time to break through the hard shell of suffering. Within the high, whitewashed walls of Potiphar's mansion, the narrative of Joseph's suffering undergoes a dangerous and subtle transformation. We might expect, based on the logic of ancient cruelty, that as a Hebrew slave without rights, he would be psychologically broken, physically abused, and subjected to the most degrading and unhealthy tasks until he died of anonymous exhaustion. But the exact opposite happens. God's blessing upon Joseph's life was so radiating, so undeniable and tangible, that it began to positively contaminate everything around him, altering the domestic economy of his captor. Potiphar, though a pagan immersed in Egyptian idolatry, was not blind to the supernatural. He perceived that there was an invisible hand upon that young foreigner. The Bible records, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did prosper in his hand. Joseph did not work with the dragged-out bitterness of a victim. He worked with the diligent excellence of a king in disguise. He organized the accounts, optimized resources, managed the other servants fairly, and brought unprecedented prosperity to the Egyptian captain. As an inevitable result of this anointed competence, Joseph was promoted. He went from being a common field or cleaning slave to becoming the chief steward, the absolute administrator of all Potiphar's possessions. Suddenly, the waiting landscape changed dramatically. Joseph now lived in a comfortable house, wore high-quality Egyptian linen clothing, ate the finest food the Nile Delta produced, and exercised royal authority over other free men and slaves. This waiting phase is what I call the golden cage test, or the trap of false stability. It is a treacherous and seductive moment in the journey of those who await a great promise from God. Joseph's life improved significantly compared to the bottom of the cistern or the current of the slave market. He had comfort, he had respect, he had a functional and predictable routine. For the vast majority of people, this would be enough to declare victory and end the search. The temptation here would be spiritual complacency. Joseph could have rationalized his situation theologically. Well, maybe the dreams of ruling the world and seeing the sun and moon bow down were just delusions of grandeur from a spoiled childhood. The concrete reality is this: I am a luxury slave, the trusted man of one of Pharaoh's officials. At least I'm not dead in the desert. At least I have food on the table and a safe roof over my head. I'll sit here. Maybe Potiphar will give me an Egyptian wife, I'll have my children, and I'll die peaceful and satisfied. Stagnation disguised as relative success is the graveyard of many divine purposes. Many of us stop praying and waiting for the great because we settle for the average. We accept the job that pays the bills but kills the soul. We accept the relationship that has no kingdom purpose but cures immediate loneliness. We exchange the palace of destiny for the Potiphar's house of convenience. But Joseph, deep in his vibrant and restless soul, knew he wasn't born to manage another man's wealth. He knew he was a prince in captivity. The blessing in Potiphar's house wasn't his final destination, it was his training ground. God was using Potiphar's property as a government simulator. If Joseph didn't learn to manage a complex mansion with integrity, he would never be able to manage a nation in crisis. Household economics, personnel management, the logistics of agricultural supplies, everything he learned there would be vital years later, during the 7 years of global famine. God was redeeming the time of slavery by transforming it into learning time. Yet even with apparent success, Joseph's soul groaned in the silence of the night. He was not yet free. He had not yet seen his father's face. The original promise was still dead and buried. And God, who loved Joseph too much to let him languish in the comfort of mediocrity, was about to allow a moral earthquake that would shatter that fragile stability and propel Joseph to the next level of depth, a much darker level, but much closer to the throne. Joseph's prosperity and beauty attracted glances that were not of administrative admiration. The Bible notes that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Potiphar's wife, a woman accustomed to having everything she desired in a society where pleasure was worshipped as a god, cast covetous eyes on the young Hebrew. What began as furtive glances in the hallways soon turned into explicit and daily harassment. Lie with me. This repeated proposal was not merely a lascivious sexual invitation. It was a strategic shortcut to power. If Joseph accepted, he would have the unconditional protection of the lady of the house. He could consolidate his untouchable position. He could have a life of secret pleasures and political security. But Joseph instantly understood that this invitation was actually a foundation test. Waiting reveals who we are when no one is watching and when the price of integrity is high. Joseph knew he could not hasten his happiness through sin. He refused day after day with a firmness that irritated the predator. Joseph's response reveals the compass of his soul. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Note the theological precision. He didn't say sin against Potiphar, although that was true. He said, against God. Joseph's loyalty was vertical before it was horizontal. He preferred to lose his job and his tunic rather than lose the presence of the one who had been with him since the cistern. But integrity has a very high price in the world of fallen men. One day when the house was empty, a trap of opportunity, the woman grabbed him by his clothes, demanding satisfaction. Joseph, in an act of desperate moral heroism, fled. He ran outside, but left his cloak in her hands. Once again, Joseph loses a cloak. First his father's colorful tunic, now the steward's tunic. He was stripped again. Joseph's refusal wounded the narcissistic pride of that woman, and her obsessive love instantly turned to vengeful hatred. She used the cloak, proof of Joseph's faithfulness, as fabricated evidence of a crime he did not commit. The trap was sprung, and the false stability of Potiphar's household crumbled upon the innocent man's head, proving that in the school of waiting on God, the immediate reward for doing the right thing is often not a medal but a dungeon. When Potiphar's guards dragged Joseph out of the mansion, amidst the hysterical and feigned cries of the rejected wife, he wasn't taken back to the slave market to be resold. The charge was attempted rape against the wife of a high-ranking official. The standard sentence for a Hebrew slave in this case would have been summary and brutal execution. The fact that Potiphar chose prison instead of death suggests a silent doubt in the captain's mind. He knew Joseph's character and he knew his wife's character. But politics demanded that someone pay the price for the honor of the house. And so, Joseph was demoted once more. He was thrown into the house of prison, the place where the king's prisoners were held. The Hebrew word used here is sohar, which implies a round fortress or a tower, but Joseph's experience is later described as a pit, bore, suggesting an underground, damp and lightless confinement. The sound of the heavy bronze or wooden door closing behind him was the end of any immediate human hope. If the cistern in Dothan was a shock and slavery a humiliation, prison was a burial. Joseph was buried alive. He had done everything right. He had fled from the appearance of evil. He had honored God. He had protected his master's reputation. And the payment for this radical holiness was the total loss of freedom. Imagine the devastating theological crisis that must have exploded in this young man's mind as his eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness of the cell. The logic of cause and effect, the childish idea that if we do good, we will receive good, was shattered. Joseph discovered in the hardest possible way that in God's mysterious economy, obedience often leads us to a worse place before it leads us to a better one. Righteousness is not a shield against suffering. Sometimes it is the very invitation to the fire of trial. Now Joseph is at rock bottom again, but this time it's deeper, darker, and the sentence is indefinite. This is where the days begin to drag on and lose their shape. Psalm 105, in performing a spiritual autopsy of that period in Joseph's life, delivers a surgical phrase that most translations soften, but which in the original is visceral. Whose feet were fastened with fetters, his soul entered into iron, or the iron entered his soul. The image is one of painful fusion. Initially, the chains hurt Joseph's skin, causing infection, pain, and restriction. But over time, the rigidity, coldness, and indestructible resistance of the iron became part of the inner structure of his character. The spoiled 17-year-old boy, who wore the colorful silk tunic and boasted of his dreams to his brothers, had no iron in his soul. He had arrogance, he had vision but no weight. He had destiny, but no structure to withstand the pressure of government. The Egyptian prison was not a modern rehabilitation center. It was a repository of oblivion. It was the place where Pharaoh threw those he wanted to erase from political memory. Joseph went from being the prodigy steward whom everyone admired to being a number on a roll call, surrounded by political criminals, murderers, and conspirators. The prison routine is the ultimate test of patience and sanity. Nothing is happening. There is no news from Canaan. Jacob thinks he has been dead for years. His brothers have forgotten him and moved on with their lives. God seems to have taken a vow of absolute silence. It is in this existential vacuum that the true spiritual battle takes place. The war is not against a visible demon, but against the inner voice that whispers incessantly, "The dreams were a lie. You were deceived by your own faith. God doesn't care about justice, he only watches." However, observe the supernatural resilience of this man. Even buried in the dungeon, Joseph refuses to succumb to bitterness or victimhood. He could have spent his days sitting in a corner, crying, plotting revenge against Potiphar's wife, or cursing the day he was born. But, incredibly, he begins to serve. The chief jailer, a man hardened by his association with the scum of society, sees something different in this Hebrew, a light that the darkness of the dungeon could not extinguish, a skill that did not need applause to function. And in an act that defies prison logic, the jailer entrusts the administration of the prison to the prisoner. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and he was in charge of all that was done there. Joseph is practicing governance in hell. He is organizing chaos. He is caring for other suffering prisoners, listening to the stories of broken men, mediating conflicts in an overcrowded cell, distributing the little food fairly. This teaches us the most powerful secret about surviving the waiting time without going insane. Serve where you are, with what you have. Joseph didn't wait to get out of prison to act as a governor. He acted as a governor inside the prison, even wearing rags. He transformed the place of his pain into the place of his ministry. He understood that if he couldn't change the external circumstance, the bars, he could change the internal atmosphere, the purpose. Passive waiting destroys the soul, creates spiritual mold. But active waiting, serving, working, loving your neighbor even when God doesn't deliver you, preserves hope and strengthens the iron. God was using prison as the university of the kingdom. Without the dungeon experience, Joseph wouldn't have had the thick skin necessary to deal with Egypt's dirty politics, nor the deep empathy to cope with the coming world famine. He was learning about human nature in its rawest form, about the injustice of the judicial system, about the pain of the forgotten. What seemed like wasted time and a wasted life was, in fact, intensive learning. Joseph was being marinated in obscurity so that, when the light finally came on, he wouldn't burn out, but shine. Stagnation was killing the dreamy boy to give birth to the father of the nation. The suffocating monotony of the prison, that endless grey cycle of waking, counting prisoners, distributing mouldy bread, and listening to laments, undergoes a seismic rupture, not by a bloody rebellion or a cinematic escape, but by the unexpected arrival of two men who definitely did not belong there. The heavy dungeon door opens with a different creak that day, and the guards push into the pit not highway robbers or runaway slaves, but two men dressed in the finest linen of the court, albeit now soiled and torn by recent misfortune. They were the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of the king of Egypt. These were not low-ranking servants or common cooks. They were ministers of state, men of the highest trust who had daily and intimate access to the sacred body of the pharaoh, who tasted his food and wine, protecting the god-king from poisonings and conspiracies. Their presence in the pit where Joseph was held, the Hebrew word for Joseph's prison is bor, meaning cistern or hole, reinforcing the idea of an underground confinement, immediately altered the atmosphere. Suddenly, the prison became a bizarre and somber anteroom to the royal palace. Fate, with its ironic sense of humor, brought the politics of the empire into Joseph's misfortune. The captain of the guard, perhaps Potiphar himself or his immediate successor, makes an administrative decision that reveals the continuity of divine favor upon Joseph. He assigns him to serve specifically these two illustrious men. Notice the divine irony and the pedagogical humiliation of this moment. Joseph, who had prophetic dreams of ruling over sheaves of wheat and stars, is now transformed into the personal waiter of luxury prisoners. He is tasked with cleaning their latrines, bringing water to wash their feet, and listening to their endless complaints about their demotion and the injustice of Pharaoh. To the proud flesh, this is a brutal demotion. To the spirit in training, it is an irreplaceable strategic lesson. God was placing Joseph in direct and forced contact with royal protocol. Serving these men in the silence of his cell, Joseph was learning through daily conversations and court gossip how Pharaoh's complex mind worked, what the political intrigues of the palace were, how to behave in the presence of royalty, and how to speak the language of power. Those days serving the cupbearer and the baker were the crash course in diplomacy and etiquette that Joseph would desperately need in the future, although at the time it seemed like just more unfair slave labor. Waiting is never a dead and passive time. It is a school where the vital curriculum is hidden in trivial and humiliating tasks. Joseph listened to the palace stories while sweeping the cold floor, absorbing precious information that would one day help save civilization. But time passes. The Bible says they were in prison for some time, days, weeks, perhaps months of uncertainty. The novelty of their arrival wore off, the hope of a quick release vanished, and the crushing weight of silence began to grind them down. On one particular morning, Joseph enters the cell to perform his routine servant duties and finds a palpable atmosphere of terror, a density in the air that weighed heavily on his lungs. The biblical text says, "And Joseph looked upon them in the morning, and behold, they were troubled." Joseph's emotional sensitivity here is remarkable and is the key to his turning point. A man embittered by his own injustice, consumed by self-pity, would never notice the sadness of others. Wounded people often become selfish, obsessively focused on their own pain, unable to see beyond their own navel. But Joseph, even wronged, even forgotten, kept his heart soft and his eyes open to his neighbor. He asks, "Why are your faces so sad today?" This simple question, asked in a dark hole, is the key that unlocks his destiny and that of the entire nation of Israel. If Joseph had entered, done the silent work, left the food, and left, he would have died in that prison, anonymous and forgotten. Genuine interest in the suffering of others was the catalyst for the miracle. In God's waiting room, compassion is the tool that digs the escape tunnel. They respond with the anguish of those facing the abyss. We had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it. In ancient Egypt, dreams were not seen as psychic residues of the day, but as direct messages from the gods, verdicts of destiny, or warnings of death. To have a vivid and terrifying dream and not have access to the magicians and wise men to decipher, it was like receiving a sealed letter with the date of your execution and not being able to open it. Their anguish was not just curiosity, it was the paralyzing fear of the hidden future. It is in this moment of absolute tension, in the damp darkness of a sunless morning, that Joseph shines with a spiritual authority that transcends his chains of slavery. Before two powerful officials of the greatest empire on earth, the young Hebrew declares with prophetic boldness, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me." Note Joseph's robust and unwavering theology in the midst of personal hell. He doesn't arrogantly say, "I know how to interpret." He says, "God knows." Joseph did not allow imprisonment, betrayal, and abandonment to steal his faith in God's sovereignty and communication. He could have thought, God, the one who let me be sold by my brothers, the one who let me be imprisoned for a lie? I don't want to talk about him. He doesn't speak to me." But no, Joseph kept the channel open. He knew that the gift within him did not depend on the circumstances around him. The anointing works just as well in prison as in the palace. He was willing to be God's channel to bless others, even when God seemed to be in absolute silence about his life. That's spiritual maturity, using your gift to unlock the destiny of someone who is about to leave, while you remain trapped, trusting that the God who interprets dreams also writes stories. The silence in the damp cell is broken by the trembling voice of the chief cupbearer. Encouraged by Joseph's theological confidence, he decides to expose the intimacy of his subconscious. He narrates his dream, and as the words flow, the prison atmosphere seems to dissolve, transporting everyone there to a vibrant, dreamlike reality. "In my dream, there was a vine before me," he begins, "and on the vine were 3 branches, and it was as if it budded, and its blossom came forth, and its clusters ripened into grapes." The description is sensory and carries an urgency of life. Nature in the dream did not follow the slow pace of agriculture, but accelerated towards fruition. He continues, his eyes shining as he recalls the feeling of power. "And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand." To the average observer, it might seem like just the ravings of a man thirsty for wine or longing for his job. But for Joseph, attuned to the frequency of the Spirit, the dream was a vivid video of the immediate future. The interpretation flowed from his lips not as an uncertain guess, but as an accomplished fact. This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your post. Imagine the physical wave of relief that must have washed over the cupbearer. The death sentence hanging over his head had been revoked by the court of heaven. In 72 hours, he would go from the musty smell to the perfume of royal gardens. He would stop drinking dirty water and start serving the most expensive wine in the world. Hope, once a nearly extinguished ember, had become a blazing fire of euphoria. Observing the scene from the corner of his cell, the master baker feels a pang of envy mixed with optimism. Human logic is linear and often deceptive. If my colleague's dream had a happy ending, and we are both in the same situation, accused of similar crimes, surely my fate will also be one of mercy. The Bible explicitly states, "When the master baker saw that the interpretation was good." He was motivated by the good interpretation, not by the pursuit of truth. He wanted validation of his desire for freedom, not necessarily the voice of God. He recounts his dream with fragile confidence. "I also dreamed, and behold, 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. And in the uppermost basket were all kinds of Pharaoh's baked goods, the work of a baker, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." The baker's dream narrative contains subtle, yet terrifying details that differ drastically from the cupbearer's dream. In the cupbearer's dream, he was the active agent. He picked the grapes, he squeezed them, he served the king. There was intimacy, service, and surrender. In the baker's dream, he was passive. The baskets were on his head, but he did not deliver them to Pharaoh. Worse still, nature, represented by the birds, was not there to cooperate, like the vine that sprouted, but to steal. In the ancient world, and in biblical symbolism, birds of prey descending upon meat or bread were unmistakable omens of curse and death, recalling the scene of Abraham scaring away the birds of prey from the sacrifice or the covenant curses in Deuteronomy. The baker was unknowingly describing his own execution. This is where Joseph's character is tested in the fire of prophetic integrity. It would have been infinitely easier, safer, and more comfortable to lie. Joseph could have said, "The baskets mean you will return to bake bread for the king in 3 days." He would have earned the baker's gratitude, avoided the discomfort of delivering bad news, and maintained peace in the cell. But a prophet who edits God's message to please men loses his authority in the spiritual world. Joseph knew that his loyalty to the truth was the only currency he had. He looks into the eyes of that hopeful man, and with a courage bordering on holy cruelty, delivers the verdict. "This is your interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you." The wordplay is brutal. For the cupbearer, lifting up his head meant exaltation and honor. For the baker, it meant literal decapitation. Joseph continues, describing the final horror. "And he will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." The silence that followed that statement must have weighed as heavy as lead. Joseph proved there that he was neither an emotional manipulator nor an elite flatterer. In the waiting room of life, we are constantly tempted to dilute the truth, to gain advantages, to say what people want to hear to secure connections. But Joseph maintained absolute prophetic integrity. He served the truth to both, the truth that liberates and the truth that condemns. He was not the source of their destiny. He was merely the faithful reader of the divine decree. The next 3 days in prison were a psychological study of unbearable contrasts. On one side, the cupbearer counted down the hours to his reintegration party, adjusting his clothes, smiling at the walls. On the other, the baker, crouched in terror, observed every shadow, perhaps praying that Joseph was a charlatan, that the prophet was wrong, and in the middle of them, Joseph. He carried the burden of knowing the end of both their stories. He knew that in 72 hours the cell would be empty, but in tragically opposite ways. This experience forged in Joseph the ability to deal with life and death with sobriety, an essential quality for someone who, in the future, would have the power to decide who would eat and who would go hungry during the great drought. Prison wasn't just teaching Joseph theology, it was teaching him the terrible weight of God's sovereignty. The 3rd day dawns with an electric energy that penetrates even the thick walls of the dungeon. It is Pharaoh's birthday, a date that in ancient Egypt was not merely a celebration of age, but a national liturgical feast, a day of royal decrees, extravagant banquets, and life or death decisions. For Joseph and his 2 cellmates, the distant sound of trumpets and the atypical movements of the guards confirmed that the clock of prophecy had struck 0. The prison door opens, and the surgical precision of God's word, spoken through Joseph's mouth, begins to materialize before their eyes. The guards call out the names. The chief cupbearer is taken away to be washed and dressed. The chief baker is taken away for execution. There was no room for error, no middle ground. Joseph's interpretation was exact. He watched as a silent witness to divine sovereignty. One man walk toward restoration and another be dragged to the gallows, exactly as the dreams had predicted. But in the turmoil of this departure, a brief moment of desperate intimacy occurs, revealing the human frailty of the prophet. While the chief cupbearer is being prepared to leave, radiant with the prospect of returning to the palace, Joseph allows his robust theology to give way to his visceral need for help. He holds the man's arm, looks deep into his eyes with the intensity of someone drowning and seeing a rope being thrown, and makes a plea that echoes the accumulated pain of years of injustice. The Bible records the cry of Joseph's soul. "But remember me when it goes well with you, and please show me kindness and mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house." Analyze the structure of this request. Joseph opens his resume of innocence to justify his plea. "For indeed, I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here I have done nothing that they should put me in this pit." Joseph is shouting, "I don't belong here. I am a victim of a corrupt system. Please, you will be in the ear of the most powerful man on earth. Use your influence. Repay the favor I did you. I gave you the good news. Now be my good news." There is no sin in asking for help. Joseph did not err morally in seeking a political connection. But the brutal theological lesson that is about to be taught to him, and to all of us who hope, is about the danger of transferring our hope from the God of promise to the human channel of promise. Joseph placed a messianic expectation on that public official. At that moment, for Joseph, the Savior did not seem to be the God of Abraham, but Pharaoh's cupbearer. He saw a human door opening and tried to put his foot through it before it closed. His reasoning was perfectly logical, fair, and meritocratic. "I helped you in your worst moment. I used my spiritual gift to calm your heart. Now, the law of reciprocity demands that you help me." Joseph believed that his liberation would be a payment for his service. He saw in the cupbearer his final crutch to get out of the hole. The door closes. The cupbearer leaves, taking with him Joseph's feverish hope. The baker is led to his death, and Joseph is alone again. Silence returns to the cell, but now it is a silence laden with a different kind of anxiety. Joseph is no longer waiting passively. He is actively waiting for the return of the favor. Imagine the following days in Joseph's mind. He must have jumped at every sound of footsteps in the stone corridor. It's now. It's Pharaoh's messenger with the release decree. He must have rehearsed what he would say to the king. He must have gathered his few and meager belongings in a corner, ready to leave at any second. He lived the first week in a restrained euphoria, thinking, "The cupbearer must be waiting for the right moment. Perhaps when Pharaoh is drinking wine, he will say, 'Your Majesty, there is an innocent young Hebrew who can see the future.'" But Joseph's reliance on human connection was the last structure of the flesh that needed to be demolished. God needed to break that crutch as well. The waiting has a surgical purpose, to remove all our alternatives, all our schemes and shortcuts, until only God remains. If the cupbearer had fulfilled his promise immediately, Joseph would have left prison as a protege of the cupbearer, a former slave who got a better job through political connections. He would have owed his freedom to a man. He would have been morally indebted to a palace official, perhaps becoming a servant of the cupbearer for the rest of his life. But God had a plan where Joseph owed nothing to anyone except the Lord, so that Joseph could look at Pharaoh in the future and say with authority, "It is not in me, God will provide." He needed to learn that salvation does not come from chariots, nor horses, nor palace influences. The disappointment with man was programmed by God not to hurt Joseph, but to ensure that the glory of his liberation would be exclusive. God was protecting Joseph from being a cupbearer's man, so that he could undoubtedly be a man of God. But oh, how that lesson hurts as hope is being crushed by the clock. And so we enter the most excruciating, dark, and psychologically devastating period of Joseph's life. The silence after hope. The Bible concludes Genesis chapter 40 with a phrase that falls like a leaden tombstone on the chest of the attentive reader. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And the following verse, opening chapter 41, begins with a temporal marker that crushes us. And it came to pass after 2 whole years. Pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and feel the chronological and emotional weight of these 3 words. 2 years, whole, not 2 days of bureaucratic delay at the palace, not 2 weeks of Pharaoh's busy schedule. More than 730 days of sunrise and sunset, witnessed through the same bars, with the same food, the same smell, and the same absence of news. Try to visualize the chronology of disappointment in Joseph's mind. The first week after the cupbearer's departure was undoubtedly lived in a rush of anticipation. Every time the prison door creaked, Joseph's heart raced. This is it. It's the royal messenger. The cupbearer kept his word. He remained clean, alert, perhaps rehearsing his thank you speech, but the week turned into a month. Doubt, like a poisonous ivy, began to take root in the cracks of his faith. Didn't he find the right moment? Was Pharaoh on a military campaign? He'll speak next week for sure. So, the first month turned into the 6th month. Hope began to wither, confirming the proverb Solomon would write centuries later. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Bitterness tried to take deep root. Joseph had to fight violent thoughts. That ungrateful traitor. I saved his mind, I gave him back his future, and he's there drinking exotic wines and laughing at banquets, while I rot here in this hole forgotten by God and men. And then a year passed. Cold resignation. The terrible realization that he had been completely erased from the memory of the only man who had the power to help him. Joseph had to organize the funeral of his human hope. He had to look at the door and admit, no one comes. What happens to a man's spiritual structure during 2 whole years of absolute emptiness? This is the abyss of waiting. It is the moment when Sunday theology no longer works and faith needs to become survival. Joseph had to make the most difficult decision of his life. Would he continue serving God even if God never took him out of there? Would he continue being a good prison administrator, caring for the other prisoners, even without any prospect of promotion or freedom? We believe, from the evidence of Joseph's future character, that it was precisely in those 2 years of silence that the iron definitively entered his soul. Youthful anxiety died. The neurotic need for human approval died. The dependence on political schemes and connections died. Joseph became a solid, weighty, profound man. He learned to find God in the dark. He discovered that God's presence is not measured by external favorable circumstances, but by supernatural inner support. God allowed the cupbearer to forget for a supreme strategic reason. God's time is not chronos, the sequential time of the clock. It is kairos, the opportune and ripe time. If the cupbearer had remembered Joseph in the first week, what would have happened? Pharaoh would have released Joseph as a trivial act of mercy. Joseph would have left prison as an ex-convict, a vulnerable foreigner wandering the streets of Memphis or Thebes, perhaps trying to hitch a ride on a caravan to return to Canaan as a failure, or trying to find manual labor. He would have been free, yes, but he would have been out of purpose. He would have had his freedom, but he would have lost his destiny. But by keeping him imprisoned for another 2 years, God was keeping Joseph in reserve. Human forgetfulness was, in fact, divine protection. Joseph was being hidden in the shadow of God's hand, preserved from the world until the world was desperate enough to need not just an interpreter, but a savior. God was waiting for the famine crisis to ripen in the womb of history. God was waiting for Pharaoh to have the right dream on the right night. Joseph's stagnation was, in fact, a waiting position. He was on the bench, ready to enter the field the minute the game of world history was in danger. To live those 2 years without knowing the end of the story, without a prophet to say, "Hold on tight, only 3 more months to go." That is the ultimate test of faith. It's the waiting room where boys die and governors are born. Joseph learned that faithfulness in anonymity is the only path to authority in public life. He was cured of haste. And when you are cured of haste, you become dangerous to hell because you enter the rhythm of eternity. Joseph didn't know it, but those were the last days he would sleep on the cold ground. The turning point was marked on God's calendar, and it wouldn't come through the kindness of a friend, but through the disturbance of a king. While Joseph counted the marks on the wall of his cell, completing the excruciating 2-year cycle of absolute silence, the spiritual atmosphere in Pharaoh's palace a few miles away was about to collapse completely. God's clock, which seemed broken or stopped inside the prison, was racing furiously at the head of the monarch's bed. It was a warm night on the banks of the Nile, and Pharaoh, considered by his people not only a king, but the living incarnation of the god Horus, the sacred mediator between heaven and earth, was sleeping in the untouchable comfort of his royal linen sheets. He was protected by elite guards, surrounded by magical amulets and household gods. But Joseph's God, who respects no borders, armed guards, or pagan deities, invaded Pharaoh's mind with a nocturnal terror that the empire's money could not bribe and the army could not combat. The Bible simply says, Pharaoh dreamed. But it wasn't an ordinary dream, the result of indigestion, political stress, or the day's remnants. It was a coded divine revelation, a theological missile specifically designed to dismantle Egypt's national security. In the dream, Pharaoh stood by the Nile River. For an ancient Egyptian, the Nile was not just water. It was the god Hapi, the giver of life, the pulsating artery that guaranteed the nation's agriculture and economy. To see the Nile calm was to see the guarantee of the future. But from the midst of this sacred security, 7 cows emerged. The cow was a sacred animal in Egypt, associated with the goddess Hathor, a symbol of fertility, nourishment, and motherhood. The first 7 were beautiful to behold and fat of flesh, grazing on the bank, the perfect image of Egyptian prosperity and stability. But then the scene transformed into a grotesque and surreal horror film. 7 other cows rose from the same sacred river, but these were ugly to look at and thin of flesh. Skeletal, famished creatures with their ribs showing, exuding the smell of death. And in an act of unnatural cannibalism that made Pharaoh writhe in his bed, the thin cows attacked and devoured the fat cows. The most disturbing detail, however, was the result. After eating the bounty, the thin cows remained as thin and ugly as before. The dream repeated itself with ears of corn, reinforcing the message with divine insistence. The source of life, the river and the land, was becoming the mouth of death, and the famine to come would be so profound that it would erase any memory of the previous abundance. When morning arrived, the palace was plunged into chaos. The text says that the Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. The Hebrew word here, paem, suggests a violent pounding, an uncontrollable inner agitation, like a bell ringing a fire alarm in the middle of the night. The king knew, with the intuition of one who wears the crown, that this was not a random nightmare. It was a warning from the gods, a cosmic sentence that he could not read but felt in his bones. Desperate for clarity, he summoned all the soothsayers, wise men, and magicians, Hatumim, of Egypt. These men were the intellectual elite of the ancient world, the guardians of Thoth's hidden library, masters in the interpretation of signs, stars, and dreams. They had entire manuals dedicated to oneromancy. They were the doctors of the time, paid handsomely to ensure that the pharaoh had peace of mind. But faced with Pharaoh's trembling account, there was an awkward and terrifying silence in the throne room. There was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Why? How could the greatest concentration of wisdom in the world fail before a dream about cows? The answer is theological. God encrypted the message. The God of the Hebrews blocked the understanding of Egyptian occultism. He made the wisdom of the world mad to prepare the exclusive stage for a Hebrew prisoner. God purposefully created an intelligence crisis in the palace. He silenced the wise men so that the king would have to listen to the slave. The impotence of the magicians was the golden opportunity of providence. The world was mute, paralyzed, waiting for someone with the right connection to heaven to open their mouth. It is in this vacuum of answers, where panic begins to replace royal protocol, that the chief cupbearer's memory suffers an electric shock. The 2-year forgetfulness is broken not by loyalty to Joseph, but by fear of Pharaoh. Seeing his king on the verge of a nervous breakdown and the magicians humiliated, the cupbearer realizes that he holds the key to the enigma in his pocket, a key he has negligently kept and ignored for 730 days. He approaches the throne trembling and utters a confession that is, at the same time, an apology and an admission of guilt. "I remember my sins today." He recounts the story of the imprisonment, but observe with painful attention how he describes Joseph. He does not use his name. He says, "A young man, a Hebrew, a servant of the captain of the guard," three qualifiers that in Egyptian society were synonymous with absolute irrelevance. Young man without life experience, Hebrew, a despised foreigner since the Egyptians abhorred Hebrew shepherds, and servant without social status, property of another. The cupbearer was telling Pharaoh, "The answer to your cosmic terror, O king, lies in the mouth of a nobody rotting in your captain's hole." It was an absurd and risky proposition. In normal times of peace, Pharaoh would never seek advice from a Hebrew slave with a criminal record. But crisis levels human pride. When the pain is great enough, kings listen to beggars. Pharaoh's desperation for the truth was greater than his racial or social prejudice. The order was given immediately, cutting through the air like a whip. "Bring him." Joseph's waiting room, locked for years, was about to be broken open by the palace's needs. The time of stagnation was over. The time of acceleration had begun. For 2 whole years, Jose had woken to the same monotonous sounds: the dripping of water on the stone, the crawling of rats, and the muffled moans of the prisoners. But on that particular morning, the silence of the dungeon was broken by a different sound, a sound he hadn't heard in 13 years, the sound of urgency. Hurried footsteps of royal sandals and military boots echoed through the stone corridor, growing louder and faster with each passing second. It wasn't the shuffling step of the jailer bringing bread. It was a rushing procession. The sound of heavy bolts being violently opened cut through the air. The cell door was flung open, and the light of torches invaded the usual dimness, momentarily blinding the prisoner. The Bible uses a specific Hebrew word to describe this action: rats, which means to run or to hasten. The text says, "And they brought him out of the dungeon in haste." Feel the vertigo of this transition. 1 minute, Joseph was forgotten, sitting in the filth with no prospect of a future. The next minute, he was being pulled up, dragged out of the pit by Pharaoh's elite guard. He had no time to process the change, no time for a long prayer of thanks, no time to fold his sheets or say goodbye to his cellmates. The waiting time is agonizingly slow, dragging on like Chinese torture, but the time of liberation is explosive, sudden, and dizzying. This validates a powerful theology about the nature of God's intervention. The distance between the dungeon and the throne is not measured in kilometers or light years, but in a single divine decree. When God decides that the training time is over, he has the power to accelerate the process in such a way that he recovers lost years in hours. The stagnation of 730 days was broken in seconds. If you are waiting, understand this. God doesn't need a long bureaucratic process to change your fate. He only needs a kairos moment. God's suddenly is the answer to men's delay. However, before Joseph could step onto the polished floor of the throne room and face the God-man, there was a mandatory rite of passage, a physical transformation symbolizing a profound spiritual transition. The biblical text inserts a crucial and often overlooked cultural detail, and he shaved himself and changed his clothes and came to Pharaoh. To the modern reader, this seems like mere basic hygiene, but in the historical context of the ancient Near East, it is laden with theological significance and identity. The Hebrews, like Joseph, considered the beard a sacred symbol of masculinity, maturity, and God-given dignity. Cutting one's beard was often a sign of deep mourning or shame. The Egyptians, on the other hand, were obsessed with ritual cleanliness and hair removal. For the Egyptian elite, body and facial hair were signs of impurity, barbarity, and animality. Pharaoh would never allow a bearded and dirty man into his sacred presence. To be heard by the king, Joseph had to remove the visible mark of his Hebrew culture. He had to become Egyptian in appearance to fulfill the Hebrew purpose in essence. Imagine Joseph feeling the sharp bronze blade scrape away years of beard, watching the tufts of hair fall to the stone floor of the prison antechamber. With each stroke of the blade, he wasn't just cleaning himself, he was shedding the prisoner 450 persona. He was removing the victim identity. He was removing the musty smell, the ingrained grime, the crust of the dungeon he carried during his season of pain. Joseph understood that he couldn't take the grime of waiting into the place of promise. Many of us want promotion, but we insist on carrying our victim garb, our visible grievances, our prisoner attitude, and our smell of defeat into the palace. God says, no, shave, cleanse yourself. The past stays on the barber's floor. And there was also the change of clothes. Joseph took off his slave rags, that rough, dirty fabric, possibly infested with lice, and put on clean, fresh white linen, supplied by the palace guards. The tactile contrast on Joseph's skin, from the roughness of the dirty wool to the softness of the royal linen, must have been the first tangible sign that the nightmare was over. He was dressing for the role he did not yet have, but was about to assume. This moment of rapid preparation teaches us that when God's call comes, we must be ready to adapt, to present ourselves with excellence and dignity. Joseph didn't enter Pharaoh's presence complaining about his imprisonment, limping to gain pardon, or pleading for justice for Potiphar's false accusation. He left all that in the pile of dirty clothes in his cell. He focused entirely on the mission before him. He emerged from the pit like a statesman, clean-shaven, upright, and focused. The weight had forged in him the discipline to present himself well, even when coming from the worst possible place. He understood that opportunity doesn't wait for those who need to get ready. Opportunity finds those who are already prepared to don the cloak of the solution. Joseph was ready. The moment for which 13 years of suffering had prepared Joseph finally arrived. The great cedar doors of Lebanon, overlaid with solid gold, opened silently, revealing the throne room of Egypt. The former slave walked down the long corridor of polished stone, flanked by gigantic papyrus-shaped columns, under the critical and cynical gaze of the world's most powerful elite. Army generals, priests of Amun-Ra, royal scribes, and humiliated magicians watched in absolute silence as this strange man, clean-shaven and dressed in linen, approached, carrying on his shoulders the weight of the empire's hope. At the end of the corridor, seated on an elevated throne symbolizing the pinnacle of the world, was Pharaoh. The king's gaze was a volatile mixture of desperate anxiety and wounded divine authority. He was the man who had everything, armies, gold, lands, and worship, but had no peace of mind to sleep. Pharaoh wasted no time with diplomatic protocols or questions about the prisoner's well-being. His anguish demanded haste. He went straight to the point, throwing at Joseph a statement that carried a seductive and deadly trap for the human ego. I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Stop and consider the gravity of this offer. The most powerful man on earth was offering Joseph a platform for instant personal glory. Pharaoh was essentially saying, I've heard you're the expert. I've heard the power resides in you. Solve my problem, and I will make your life. For a man who had been forgotten, betrayed, sold, and humiliated for 13 years, the temptation to claim that power for himself, to say, yes, your majesty, I have a special gift. I am a seer. I am the solution you seek, would be overwhelming. It would be the perfect opportunity to sell himself, to secure a lifetime job at court, to make himself indispensable through personal marketing. Joseph's flesh must have been screaming, "Take the credit, this is your chance to get out of the mud." But Joseph's response is perhaps the most heroic and spiritually mature moment of his entire biography, surpassing even the flight of Potiphar's wife. Joseph looks into the eyes of the Egyptian god-man and utters a phrase that commits professional suicide in the face of human logic. "It is not in me." Biladai in Hebrew. Not at all, not me, or far be it from me. Feel the thermal shock in the room. Joseph begins by denying his own competence. He tells the king, "The information you received is wrong. I am not the keeper of the secret. I have no power whatsoever." If he had stopped the sentence there, it would have been the end of the interview, and probably a return to the dungeon or execution for uselessness. But he concludes with the theology that sustained his sanity during the dark nights of prison. God will give Pharaoh a peaceful answer. Joseph does something unthinkable. He redirects glory in a hostile environment. He points the finger upward. He introduces the true God, Yahweh, into the center of the polytheistic pagan court. He says to Pharaoh, "I am only the messenger. The sender of the letter is God. I am only the channel. The source of the water is heaven." This reveals that the waiting room fulfilled its surgical purpose. The iron entered Joseph's soul to such an extent that he no longer needed to steal God's glory to feel validated or secure. The boy who recounted dreams to exalt himself before his brothers died. The man who interprets dreams to exalt God was born. He was secure enough in his identity as a son to be humble before the king. And paradoxically, it was this radical humility that qualified him for supreme exaltation. Pharaoh, being a shrewd leader, knew how to recognize flattery and fraud. He was surrounded by magicians trying to sell their services, but seeing that Joseph wasn't trying to manipulate the situation, that he wasn't trying to promote himself, Pharaoh felt the authority of truth. He realized that this man had no agenda of his own. When you remove your ego from the equation, God enters the room. By denying power, Joseph received power. Pharaoh trusted him not because he sold himself well, but because he was transparent about the source. The king then recounts the dream of the cows and the ears of grain. As the words leave Pharaoh's mouth, the Spirit of God floods Joseph's mind with crystal clarity. What was an impenetrable enigma to the magicians was a news broadcast from the future to Joseph. He not only interprets, he decodes the global economy for the next 14 years. Pharaoh's dream is one. The 7 beautiful cows are 7 years, and the 7 lean cows will be 7 years of famine. Joseph explains that God showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The repetition of the dream means that this thing is determined by God, and God is hastening to do it. But Joseph doesn't stop at interpretation. And here we see the final transformation of the prisoner into governor. A simple seer would have told the future and stopped, waiting for a tip. But Joseph, trained in managing Potiphar's household and administering the prison, assumes the posture of a statesman. He dares to give unsolicited advice to the most powerful man in the world. Therefore, let Pharaoh now look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Joseph, standing there without paper or staff, draws up the first centralized rationing and food security plan in human history. He creates the solution to the problem he has just diagnosed. He proposes the creation of granaries, a 20% tax on the harvest, the 5th, and the strategic storage of grain. Silence returns to the throne room, but now it is not fear, it is awe. Pharaoh and his servants look at that former Hebrew prisoner and realize they are facing a superior intelligence, something not taught in Egyptian schools. The wait not only prepared Joseph's character, it prepared his strategic mind. Prison was God's MBA. He emerged from the pit, ready not only to foresee the future, but to save it. The moment Joseph finished presenting the economic plan to save Egypt, the atmosphere in the throne room changed dramatically. The paralyzing fear that had dominated the room dissipated, replaced by reverent awe. Pharaoh, a man accustomed to listening to advisors who talked a lot and said little, immediately perceived that he was witnessing a spiritual anomaly. The wisdom that flowed from the mouth of that young Hebrew was not human. It was not derived from the books of Thoth, nor from Egyptian political experience. It was a wisdom from above, pure, peaceful, and full of mercy. The biblical text records the king's reaction as he turned to his servants, the same elite who had despised Joseph minutes before, and asked a rhetorical question that sealed the former slave's fate. Could we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God? Stop and absorb the theological impact of this phrase. A pagan king, considered a god on earth, is forced to acknowledge the presence of the one God, Elohim, within a foreign prisoner. Pharaoh saw in Joseph not only administrative intelligence, he saw the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God. Joseph's holiness, preserved in the darkness of prison, shone so brightly in the light of the palace that it became undeniable even to idolaters. This teaches us that true advancement does not come from resumes, connections, or manipulation. It comes from the anointing. When the Spirit of God rests upon someone, He creates a distinction that the world cannot ignore, even if it tries. The weight in the cistern and the dungeon served to empty Joseph of himself, so that he could be so filled with the Spirit that the presence of God would overflow from him and convince an empire. Pharaoh then turned to Joseph and pronounced the decree of exaltation. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so understanding and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. In the blink of an eye, the world's hierarchy was turned upside down. The man who had no authority even over his own body now had authority over millions of lives. The man who obeyed the jailer now gave orders to the generals. Divine acceleration recovered 13 years of delay in 13 minutes of conversation. And then the ritual of transferring power begins, a visual ceremony that must have sent shivers down the spines of those watching. Pharaoh removes the signet ring from his own hand. That ring was not a decorative jewel, it was the king's signature. The power to legislate, to condemn, and to absolve. It was Egypt's unlimited credit card. By placing the ring on Joseph's finger, Pharaoh was saying, "When he speaks, it is I who speak." Joseph, whose hands had been bound by ropes and chains, now felt the weight of royal gold. Next, the order to clothe him, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen. Remember Joseph's clothing. First, the colorful tunic, favor of the father, was torn. Then the slave's cloak, service to Potiphar, was left behind. Then the prisoner's garment, humiliation, was worn until it wore out. Now God clothes him with fine linen, shesh, the fabric reserved for royalty and priests. God restored the tunic, but in an improved and untouched version, and he put a gold chain around his neck. Where before there was the cold iron of the shackles that wounded the soul, Psalm 105, now there was the gold of authority. The scar of the iron was covered by the glory of gold. God is an expert at covering the marks of our pain with symbols of his honor. But Joseph's vindication would not be merely internal within the walls of the palace. It needed to be public. The waiting room is often solitary and private, but the exaltation of God is always public. Pharaoh orders Joseph to get into his second chariot, the viceroy's chariot, and commands a parade through the streets of the capital. Heralds ran ahead shouting an Egyptian word, abrek, which means kneel down or make way. Imagine this cinematic scene. The grand palace doors swing open and the royal chariot emerges, gleaming in the sun. A crowd gathers. And who is in the crowd? Most likely, Potiphar, the captain of the guard, was there, gazing in awe at his former slave, the one he unjustly imprisoned, now wearing Pharaoh's ring. Potiphar's wife, the woman who tried to destroy Joseph's life with a lie, now had to kneel in the dust as he passed by in glory. The jailer, the substitute baker, the men who despised him, all had to bend the knee. This is the literal fulfillment of Psalm 23. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. God did not exalt Joseph in a secret room. He exalted him on the main avenue before the eyes of those who tried to bury him. God's vindication is not petty vengeance. Joseph did not use his power to have Potiphar's wife killed or to imprison Potiphar. The greatest vengeance was his success. The mere sight of Joseph's exaltation was judgment upon their wickedness. Joseph passed by them not with a look of hatred, but with the serene gaze of one who knows that if they had not pushed him into the pit, he would not have reached the throne. Even evil worked together for good. Pharaoh even gave him a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah, which means the revealer of secrets or the savior of the world. And he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of a priest from On. Joseph was now 30 years old. He had entered slavery at 17. 13 years of waiting, 13 years of training, 13 years of the death of the self. But now, looking out over the Nile from the heights of his palace, Joseph could breathe the air of a fulfilled promise. He was no longer a passive dreamer. He was the executor of destiny. The waiting room was officially closed, the governing room was open, but the final test of Joseph's heart had not yet arrived. He already had the power. He already had the wealth. But the healing of the family wound, that was still pending. And God, the great scriptwriter, was about to bring the past back to Joseph's door, not to haunt him, but to heal him. With Pharaoh's ring on his finger and fine linen wrapped around his body, Joseph did not retire for a well-deserved vacation after 13 years of suffering. The waiting room was over, but the war room had just opened. The Bible says that Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. He did not become an office bureaucrat, governing from afar. He became a field manager. During the 7 years of plenty, while the Nile overflowed with life and the land produced in abundance, most of Egypt was undoubtedly celebrating. The human tendency in abundance is wastefulness, irresponsible celebration, and immediate consumption. If we have plenty today, we will have plenty tomorrow, the fool thinks. But Joseph, trained in the scarcity of the cistern and the restriction of prison, possessed a discipline that no one else had. He knew that plenty was temporary and that crisis was inevitable. While Egypt celebrated, Joseph built. He mobilized the nation in a campaign to build gigantic granaries in every city. He implemented a 20% tax on the harvest, collecting the surplus that would otherwise be wasted. The text says that he heaped up wheat like the sand of the sea, so much so that he stopped counting it because it was beyond number. Joseph was transforming present blessing into future security. Here we learn a vital lesson for those who have emerged from a time of waiting. How you manage your first blessing determines the longevity of your success. If Joseph had been dazzled by power and spent resources on luxury, Egypt would have starved 7 years later. The wisdom of waiting taught him the value of reserve. He ruled with the sobriety of one who knows that winter is coming even in the height of summer. But it was during those golden years, before the first dry leaf fell, that God began to heal Joseph's deepest wound, the wound of orphanhood and rejection. God gave him a wife, Asenath, and through her 2 sons. The names Joseph chooses for these boys are not random. They are theological monuments to his emotional healing. To his firstborn, he names Manasseh, which means he who makes forget. Joseph declares, "For God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." Stop and analyze this. Forgetting in the Bible doesn't mean literal amnesia. Joseph knew who his father was. He knew who his brothers were. He didn't have a memory blackout. Biblical forgetting means that the memory lost its power to hurt. It means the poison was drained from the memory. When he looked at Manasseh's face, he realized that the pain of his brother's betrayal and the longing for Jacob no longer had the power to paralyze him. He could remember without bleeding. God healed the trauma of the past by replacing it with present joy. If you are waiting for healing, know that God often heals the pain of what has been taken away by giving something new that fills the space. Manasseh is proof that it is possible to be happy again, even after being thrown into a pit by his own brothers. To his second son he gave the name Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful. Joseph's declaration is powerful. "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Note that he still calls Egypt the land of my affliction. He does not deny the reality of suffering, but celebrates the reality of fruit within suffering. He prospered in the place that was designed to destroy him. Ephraim is the testament that the barrenness of waiting was broken. Joseph now had roots, a family of his own, and fruit, resources and children. He was healed enough to face what was to come, and he needed to be, for God's clock struck again. The 7 years of plenty were over, exactly as the prophecy foretold. Overnight, the wind changed, the Nile receded, the rain ceased, the earth cracked, and the 7 years of famine began. The famine was not local, it was global. There was famine in all the lands. The entire world collapsed economically and nutritionally. Panic spread like a plague. Kings of other nations saw their stocks depleted. Entire peoples began to migrate in desperation. But in the midst of this agrarian apocalypse, there was an island of hope. But in all the land of Egypt, there was bread. When the Egyptian people, feeling the first pangs of starvation, cried out to Pharaoh for food, the king gave a single order, which exalted his viceroy: "Go to Joseph and do everything he tells you." Joseph opened the granaries. That accumulated wheat was not just food, it was life, it was power, it was the salvation of civilization. Joseph began to sell the grain, not only to the Egyptians, but to the whole world that came to Egypt to buy. He who had been sold as a slave was now the seller of life. The cistern that tried to swallow him was now the granary that fed the nations. And then the camera of the biblical narrative shifts focus, leaving the palaces of Egypt and returning to the dusty tents of Canaan, where famine also arrived with brutal force. There we find an old Jacob, still mourning his dead son, looking at his 10 remaining sons, the same men who sold Joseph. Famine gripped the family of promise. An empty stomach has the power to move men that conscience did not move. Jacob says, "Why are you looking at one another? Behold, I have heard that there is food in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, that we may live and not die." Divine irony is devastating. Famine sent by God was driving the treacherous brothers to the one place they swore never to go again, and to the one person they thought they had eliminated. They didn't know it, but they were walking straight into an ambush of grace and judgment. They descended into Egypt, mingled in the crowd of foreigners, carrying their empty sacks and their money, unaware that the man holding the key to the barn was the boy who had pleaded for mercy 20 years before. The stage was set for the most tense reunion in the history of redemption. Joseph's waiting was over. But the test of forgiveness was only beginning. The scene unfolding in the grain distribution yards of Egypt is worthy of a cinematic climax, but it carries a theological depth that transcends any human script. Amidst the noisy crowd of starving Egyptians, Nubians, Canaanites, and merchants from all parts of the known world, 10 Semitic-looking men, with dusty beards from their journey and eyes lowered in humiliation, approach the governor of the land. They don't know it, but they are walking on the razor's edge of history. That tall man, dressed in the white linen of royalty, adorned with the pharaoh's gold collar, clean-shaven face, and eyes painted with Egyptian kohl, surrounded by armed guards and interpreters, is the ghost that has haunted their conscience for 22 years. When they came before Joseph, the 10 brothers did something instinctive and terrifying. They bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Pause the film in your mind at this exact frame. 20 years earlier, in Canaan, a 17-year-old boy recounted a dream. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. At the time, this dream generated the hatred that led to the cistern. Now, on the hard ground of Egypt, the prophecy materialized in flesh and blood. The sheaves, hungry brothers, were bowing down before the sheaf that stood upright, Joseph the provider. The word of God is relentless. It may be delayed, it may be attacked, it may be thrown into a pit, but it always, invariably, comes to pass. Joseph saw it, and the Bible says, Joseph remembered his dreams. The memory of the dream was not an act of arrogance, I told you so, but of divine confirmation. He understood that all the suffering had a purpose, to lead them to that exact moment of submission, not to be crushed, but to be saved. But Joseph's reaction confuses the sentimental reader. Instead of running, embracing them, and crying, "I am Joseph, your brother," he does the opposite. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And he made himself a stranger to them and spoke harshly to them. Why this harshness? Why treat with such harshness men who were already broken by hunger? Was Joseph taking revenge? Had power corrupted him? No. Joseph was acting not as a wounded brother, but as a wise judge. He knew that cheap reconciliation does not generate profound transformation. If he revealed himself now, they would be terrified or relieved, but he would never know if they had changed. He needed to know, were they still the same envious and murderous men? Had they repented of what they had done? How would they treat Benjamin, Rachel's other son? To discover the truth, Joseph needed to stage a pressure show. The harshness was not revenge, it was a diagnostic test. Joseph accuses them of being spies. You are spies, and you have come to see the nakedness of the land. This accusation was serious and could lead to death. Fear makes men speak the truth. In their defense, they open the family records. We, your servants, are 12 brothers, and behold, the youngest is with our father today, and there is no other. Hearing there is no other, Joseph's heart must have bled. They considered him dead. They erased his existence. But the mention of the youngest, Benjamin, triggered an alarm in Joseph. Benjamin was his full-blood brother, the only other son of his mother Rachel. If they hated Joseph for being the favorite, did they also hate Benjamin? Joseph needed to see Benjamin. He needed to see if they would protect the youngest or if they would deliver him to the wolves as they had done to him. Then, Joseph issues the challenge. This is how you will be tested. You will not get out of here unless your youngest brother comes. And to ensure they felt the weight of the situation, he throws them into prison for 3 days. Imagine the divine irony. The brothers who threw Joseph into the cistern were now tasting their own medicine. For 3 days, they were locked up, experiencing a fraction of what Joseph had lived through for years. Joseph was giving them a tour of his pain. He wanted empathy to be born in them through the experience. On the third day, Joseph releases them on a modified condition. One of them would remain as a prisoner, Simeon is chosen, while the others would take food home and bring Benjamin back. It is in this moment of extreme pressure that the first moral miracle occurs. Thinking that the Egyptian governor did not understand Hebrew, since Joseph used an interpreter to maintain the disguise, the brothers begin to confess to one another. Their consciences, seared for 20 years, begin to bleed. They say, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us. We did not listen, therefore this anguish has come upon us." Joseph, hearing everything in his native language, realizes the test is working. They haven't forgotten. They've connected the present pain to the past sin. They understand that God is collecting the debt. The emotion is so strong that Joseph can't maintain his iron mask. He withdrew from them and wept. That hidden weeping reveals the governor's heart. He didn't want to punish them, he wanted to restore them, but he knew that restoration requires truth. He wipes away his tears, returns, hardens his face again, and binds Simeon before their eyes. He orders their sacks to be filled with wheat, but secretly commands that each man's money be returned to the mouth of his sack. Why return the money? Was it an act of generosity or of disturbance? Both. Joseph wanted to bless them. It was free food, but he also wanted to terrify them in a holy way. He wanted them to feel that they were losing control, that something supernatural and inexplicable was happening. When they discover the money on the way back, the effect is immediate. Their hearts failed them, and they trembled, saying to one another, "What is this that God has done to us?" For the first time in the narrative, the brothers mention God with fear. Joseph's waiting was producing repentance in the brothers. The suffering of one was being used to save the souls of many. They returned to Canaan carrying food, money, and renewed guilt, unaware that the hard man of Egypt was, in fact, the only hope of salvation they had. The stage was set for the second act, the return with Benjamin, and the final test of sacrificial love. Hunger, relentless and democratic, continued to tighten its grip on Canaan. The wheat brought from Egypt, which had seemed so plentiful at first, turned to dust at the bottom of the sacks. Jacob's family was once again facing death. But there was an insurmountable obstacle to returning to Egypt. The hard man, Joseph, had sworn that they would not see his face if they did not bring Benjamin. For old Jacob, this was asking for his own life. Benjamin was the only living memory he had left of Rachel, his beloved wife. Jacob had already lost Joseph. Losing Benjamin would be to descend into the grave in bitterness, but necessity breaks stubbornness. Judah, the brother who had the idea of selling Joseph years before, now rises with a new attitude, offering himself as guarantor. "You shall require him from my hand. If I do not bring him to you, then I shall be guilty forever." Physical hunger forces the patriarch to release his emotional idol. Jacob finally relents, sending them with gifts, double the money, and a trembling prayer, "May God Almighty grant you mercy in the sight of man." The arrival in Egypt is marked by panic. When Joseph's steward invites them into the governor's house for lunch, they don't feel honored. They feel ambushed. The guilt over the returned money still weighs heavily on them. They think it's a trap to enslave us and take our donkeys. Fear leads them to confess to a crime they didn't commit at the door of the house. But the steward, instructed by Joseph, responds with a phrase theologically shocking to an Egyptian, "Peace be with you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you this treasure." Joseph was evangelizing his own household. Even his servants knew that grace came from God. Simeon is brought out unharmed. Water is given to wash his dusty feet. The scene of terror begins to transform into a banquet of grace, and then Joseph enters. The brothers bow again, fulfilling the dream for the second time. But Joseph's eyes search for only one face. When he finally sees Benjamin, the boy he left as a baby, now a grown man, the emotional dam breaks. He asks, "Is this your youngest brother?" And he blesses him. "May God grant you his grace, my son." The pain of longing is so violent that Joseph loses his composure. He runs to the room and cries convulsively. That cry is the sound of a soul that has waited decades to see his mother's child again. But he washes his face, swallows his tears, and returns to the test. The table is set. Here, Joseph performs a miracle of observation that must have left his brothers stunned. He seats them at the table according to their birthright, from oldest to youngest, in the exact order of their birth. How could that strange Egyptian know the chronological order of 11 foreign men? The brothers looked at each other, amazed. Joseph was playing with omniscience, showing that he had total control of the situation. And then, the test of envy. Joseph orders the portions to be served, but he gives Benjamin's portion 5 times larger than the others. Why this blatant favoritism? Joseph was recreating the atmosphere of Canaan. He wanted to see the colorful tunic was now on Benjamin's plate. Would the brothers be envious again? Would they hate Benjamin for receiving more honor? But to Joseph's surprise and relief, they drank and rejoiced with him. There were no disapproving glances, no murmuring. It seemed that jealousy had been cured, but Joseph needed a final test. He needed to know if they would be loyal in crisis, not just at the feast. The banquet ends. The next morning, the brothers set off for Canaan, relieved with their sacks full and Benjamin safe. They think the nightmare is over. Little did they know that Joseph had given a secret and dangerous order to his steward. "Fill the sacks with provisions and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the youngest brother's sack." Joseph had set a trap. He planted evidence of theft. But why this apparent cruelty? Why torment the brothers who already seemed changed? Because Joseph needed to simulate the loss of Rachel again. He needed to create a situation where Benjamin, Rachel's other son, would be condemned, to see if Leah's sons, the other 10, would abandon him to save themselves. Joseph wanted to know, if you have the chance to get rid of your father's favorite son and return home free, will you do it again? The silver cup was not just a valuable object. It was the instrument of testing. The brothers leave the city, breathing the air of freedom. But suddenly, they see dust rising behind them. Joseph's steward catches up with them with the accusation, "Why did you repay evil for good? Why did you steal my master's cup?" The brothers' indignation is genuine and confident. They are so sure of their innocence that they pronounce a reckless death sentence. "Whoever is found with him shall die, and we will be his slaves." They staked everything on their honesty. The search begins, from oldest to youngest, sack by sack. Reuben, clean. Simeon, clean. Levi, Judah, Dan. One by one, the sacks are opened and nothing is found. The tension eases. They begin to smile. "See, we're honest." But then they reach the last sack. Benjamin's sack. The steward unties the knot, plunges his hand into the wheat, and pulls out the gleaming object that reflects the desert sunlight, the silver cup. The silence that falls over the desert at that moment is the sound of the world collapsing. Benjamin must have turned pale, stammering innocence. His brothers look at him in horror. 20 years ago, they would have said, "Oh, there goes Daddy's little boy causing trouble. Let him be arrested and we'll leave." But now, their reaction is proof of transformation. The Bible says, "Then they tore their clothes." Tearing clothes is the ultimate sign of shared grief and despair. They didn't accuse Benjamin, they didn't run away, they loaded the donkeys and returned to the city. All of them. They chose to return to the lion's den with their brother, guilty in the eyes of the law. They chose solidarity over individual survival. Joseph watched from the window, seeing the dust of their return. The test worked. They did not abandon their brother. But the final act of this drama, where Joseph's mask would fall and the cry of revelation would echo, now depended on the word of one man. Judah, the one who sold Joseph, was about to make the most important speech of his life, offering himself as a vicarious sacrifice and proving that God's grace can transform a brother traitor into the ancestor of the Messiah. The brothers are dragged back to Joseph's house, not as honored guests, but as criminals caught red-handed. They throw themselves to the ground before the governor, the dust of Egypt mingling with tears of terror. Joseph, still in the role of the implacable judge, asks, "What work is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can divine?" Judah, taking the lead as the spokesperson for the tragedy, refuses to defend the technical innocence of the cup theft because he recognizes the moral guilt of the past. He says, "God has found out the iniquity of your servants." He is not speaking of the silver cup. He is speaking of the sale of Joseph. They accept collective slavery as a just divine punishment, but Joseph tightens the noose. "Far be it from me that I should do such a thing. The man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant, but you go up in peace to your father." This was the easy way out. Joseph offered his 10 brothers the chance to escape freely, leaving only Benjamin behind. 20 years earlier, they would have accepted this offer in a heartbeat, but now Judah steps forward. This is the moment when Judah becomes the lion. He delivers the longest and most emotional speech in all of Genesis. He recounts his father's grief, the loss of his other brother, the fragility of Jacob's life intertwined with the boys. And then he makes the offer that changes the course of history. "Now therefore let your servant remain as a slave to my master instead of the boy, and let the boy go up with his brothers." Stop and contemplate the beauty of redemption. Judah, the man who proposed selling Joseph for profit, Genesis 37:26, now offers himself to be sold into slavery to save his brother. He becomes the substitute. He exchanges his freedom for Benjamin's freedom. This is the essence of the gospel. Judah is prefiguring his distant descendant, Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who would offer himself as a substitute for sinners. When Joseph sees this radical transformation, when he sees that Judah prefers to suffer rather than see his father suffer, that selfishness has been replaced by sacrificial love, the test ends. The dam of 13 years of silence and 9 years of stoic rule breaks. The Bible says that Joseph could not contain himself. The cry that comes from his throat is visceral, frightening the guards and officers. "Have everyone leave my presence," he orders. Joseph drives out the Egyptians. He needs this moment to be intimate, sacred, and Hebrew. Alone with the 11 trembling men, he cries so loudly that Pharaoh's house hears, and then he utters the 2 words that fall like atomic bombs in the room, "I am Joseph," and he immediately asks, "Is my father still alive?" The brothers' reaction is not one of joy, but of absolute terror. The Hebrew word is nibalu. They were disturbed, terrified, paralyzed with fear. The man who held the power of life and death over them, the man they had deceived, sold and despised, was there, alive and all-powerful. Human logic said, "Now he will kill us. Now comes vengeance." They recoil. But Joseph says, "Come closer to me." He bridges the distance. He looks into each one's eyes and recounts the story, but now through the lens of God's sovereignty. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now therefore do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Here is the master key to the whole story of Joseph and to the entire theology of waiting. Joseph rewrites the past. He does not deny their sin, whom you sold, but he reveals the higher purpose. God sent me. He says, "You thought you were the authors of my story, but you were merely unwitting instruments. It was not your envy that sent me, but God's providence." He explains that the famine would last another 5 years and that he was positioned there to ensure a remnant on earth. Joseph kisses all his brothers and weeps over them. He embraces Benjamin and weeps. Benjamin embraces Joseph and weeps. The text ends by saying, "And then his brothers spoke with him." The silence of guilt was broken by the conversation of grace. The reconciliation was complete. The family was healed. But the final lesson, the touchstone of this saga, comes years later in chapter 50, when their father Jacob dies. The brothers, still insecure, fear that Joseph will take revenge now that their father is gone. They send a message asking for forgiveness again. Joseph cries once more, wounded by their distrust, and delivers the definitive declaration of divine sovereignty, the verse that should be tattooed on the soul of those who wait. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. This is the answer to the waiting room. Evil is real. Betrayal hurts. The cistern is dark. Prison is unjust. Time drags on. But above human wickedness, above the mistakes of others, above the cupbearer's forgetfulness and Potiphar's wife's slander, there is a sovereign God who weaves all the dark threads of tragedy into a tapestry of glory. God doesn't just fix evil. He uses it. He hijacked the wickedness of the brothers to transport Joseph to the throne. If Joseph hadn't been sold, he would never have gone to Egypt. If he hadn't been imprisoned, he would never have met the cupbearer. If he hadn't met the cupbearer, he would never have reached Pharaoh. And if he hadn't reached Pharaoh, the world would have starved and the Messiah's family would have been extinct. Every tear Joseph shed was an investment in the salvation of the world. His waiting was not wasted time, it was the gestation of survival. Therefore, you who are reading this, sitting in your own cistern or pacing back and forth in your waiting cell, do not despair. God's silence is not abandonment, it is preparation. What men intended for your harm, dismissal, divorce, gossip, betrayal, God is, at this very moment, re-engineering for your good and for the good of many through you. The turning point will come. The fine linen is ready, the ring is reserved, and when you look back from the heights of your purposeful palace, you will not see scars of pain, but marks of grace. The waiting is over. The reign has begun. You have just traversed, step by step, the geography of Joseph's suffering and glory. If you have reached this final second, it is because this message was not an accident. It was an encounter. You didn't click on this video. You were guided to it because your waiting room needs a new decoration of hope. I want to ask you something very specific right now. Don't leave here without leaving a mark of your faith. Look at your life today and identify where you are. Are you in the cistern of betrayal, in Potiphar's house of hard work, in the dungeon of forgetfulness, or are you already entering the palace? Scroll down to the comments now and write only, "I am in your phase, but my God is already in the palace waiting for me." Prophesy over your own life. And if you want to be part of an army of people who aren't content with the shallows, who seek that level of depth in the Word, the subscription button is your gateway. Tap it, activate the bell, and let's transform waiting into governance together. Until the next deep dive.